What if the earliest traces of human writing were never intended as the beginning of a story, but instead as the fading echo of one already approaching its end? Imagine a world in which the first marks humanity left behind were not curious attempts to invent language, but urgent messages carved into wet clay because time was running out. In the arid lands of southern Mesopotamia, where the wind sweeps across empty plains and ancient bricks crumble beneath a relentless sun, remnants of a civilization lie scattered like bones. Beneath layers of dust and collapsed walls, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets remain hidden, mute witnesses from an age that seems too advanced to be the starting point of anything. Each tiny wedge-shaped impression, cut into clay now as hard as stone, preserves ideas so old that even our modern understanding struggles to grasp their implications. The story of these tablets did not begin with revelations or celebrations. It began quietly, with excavation teams expecting little more than ruins and rubble. When European archaeologists first arrived at sites like Uruk in the late 19th century, they imagined treasures of kings, statues of gods, perhaps fragments of lost temples. What they found instead was infinitely stranger. They unearthed stacks of clay tablets, meticulously stored, categorized, and sealed away as though someone had desperately wanted them protected. When scholars painstakingly deciphered the marks, they expected primitive accounting or early attempts at storytelling. Instead, they found sophisticated records, receipts, trade agreements, astronomical observations, medical instructions, and legal codes, all fully formed at the very dawn of civilization. How could such complexity exist at humanity's supposed beginning? According to conventional historical models, civilizations evolve slowly. We expect to see crude drawings preceding structured characters, simple farming huts before cities, rudimentary ideas before scientific breakthroughs. Yet the civilization responsible for these tablets, known today as the Sumerians, appeared in the archaeological record already fluent. Their writing system, called cuneiform, arrived not as a simple collection of symbols, but as a refined and functional linguistic tool capable of expressing law, poetry, astronomy, mathematics, economy, agriculture, and theology. They left behind no experimental phase, no trial period, nothing resembling the gradual development that marks every other known culture. Instead, Sumer enters history as if someone lifted the curtain to reveal an already constructed stage, actors rehearsed, lines memorized, everything in motion. Their cities were planned with astonishing precision, streets aligned deliberately, canals engineered to control rivers, monumental temples positioned according to celestial cycles. Their number system, based on 60 rather than 10, is still embedded in our perception of time and geometry. 60 seconds make a minute, 60 minutes make an hour, 360 degrees complete a circle. Even now, thousands of years later, we live inside a mathematical framework they shaped. How did a so-called first civilization achieve this without an evolutionary foundation? Why does their culture look less like a beginning and more like a continuation? Historians have wrestled with this anomaly for generations. Some insist that earlier developmental stages simply vanished due to erosion, or were yet to be discovered, buried deeper beneath shifting sands. Others suggest ideas must have migrated from forgotten peoples, whose identities dissolved long before written history began. But the Sumerians themselves offered a radically different explanation, one carved directly into their tablets. They did not see themselves as inventors. They saw themselves as inheritors. They wrote repeatedly that kingship, knowledge, writing, agriculture, and the laws of civilization did not originate with them but descended from the heavens, restored after a catastrophe that had erased what came before. To them, history did not begin in Sumer. It survived there. Picture yourself standing alone inside an ancient archive, long after night has settled over the world outside. You pull on cotton gloves to protect what you hold, and you lift a clay tablet from a sheltered drawer. The clay feels cool and slightly rough beneath your fingertips. Across its surface, hundreds of tiny marks catch the faint glimmer of light. Each line and wedge was pressed by a reed stylus, held in the hand of a scribe who lived before the pyramids were built, before Chinese dynasties rose, before Mesoamerican pyramids pierced the sky. Their fingerprints sometimes remain, pressed into the clay before it hardened. Those fingerprints are not abstractions. They belong to real people who believed they were preserving something too important to lose. If these tablets truly represent humanity's first written memories, why do they speak not of invention, but of recollection? Why do they refer to themselves not as creators, but as restorers of something older? Why is there no record of Sumer crawling toward literacy, mathematics, or architecture through ages of experimentation? Instead, there are only accounts of things already perfected. It is as though Sumer was not the birthplace of civilization, but the safe room in which its remnants were stored after disaster struck. This idea gains traction when compared to other ancient civilizations. In Egypt, archaeologists can trace cultural development layer by layer. Early pictographs gradually evolve into hieroglyphs. Modest settlements transform into cities, and religious concepts develop complexity over time. In the Indus Valley, urban sophistication grows step by step through centuries of refinement. In China, dynastic cultures emerge from earlier villages and artifacts. Worldwide, civilization behaves like a staircase, each generation climbing upon the rungs laid by the last. Sumer, however, appears at the top of the staircase with no steps beneath it. Cities like Uruk, Lagash, Kish, and Eridu emerge seemingly at once. They possess defensive walls, irrigation systems, temples aligned with planetary cycles, and bureaucratic structures maintaining inventories, tax records, and resource distribution. The infrastructure of a mature state appears before we find evidence of its infancy. Archaeologists expected crude huts and rough clay bricks. Instead, they discovered monumental architecture and detailed administrative records. They expected trial and error. Instead, they found mastery. How could this be? The Sumerians themselves answer again and again through their inscriptions. What they knew was given. Knowledge descended. Civilization was restored, not born. Their word for this concept appears repeatedly. Not creation, but re-establishment. Something existed before them, something powerful, organized, and capable of shaping reality, and they were merely the caretakers of its fragments. These fragments were not symbolic metaphors. They were detailed. Their texts describe procedures, measurements, recipes, astronomical timings, and canonical laws with precision that suggests practical application, not mythic abstraction. Their mythology does not speak of gods spontaneously willing the world into existence. Instead, their stories describe processes, experiments, attempts, and failures, narratives unusually technical for ancient religious texts. They read like memories of practices the scribes no longer fully understood, preserved in poetic form because no other language existed to contain them. Consider their creation story. Humanity was not sculpted with divine whimsy, it was engineered. Clay mixed with essence, shaped, revised, corrected. These tales describe adjustments and prototypes, concepts disturbingly similar to modern ideas of biological manipulation or genetic refinement. Their gods are not remote cosmic abstractions, but hands-on participants, teaching humans agriculture, mathematics, irrigation systems, architecture, and law. The Sumerians did not believe they discovered these things. They believed someone had taught them. The implications are staggering. If their stories are memories rather than metaphors, if they truly documented rather than imagined, then the very roots of human civilization may lie not in gradual invention, but in sudden transmission. Not in evolution, but in restoration. Even more unsettling is how widespread these ideas become when compared across continents. The themes of a world before a great flood, of beings descending from the sky to impart knowledge, of long-lived rulers and lost ages, echo across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Hebrew texts, Hindu scriptures, Mesoamerican codices, Greek myths, all share uncanny thematic overlaps. Either humanity spontaneously invented the same stories everywhere, or each culture inherited fragments of a shared ancient memory. Archaeology provides a final twist. Beneath the earliest layers of many Mesopotamian cities lies a band of sterile flood silt, thick and uniform, separating older levels from the Sumerian rebuild. Whatever lay before them ended suddenly, washed clean by catastrophic waters. The Sumerians rebuilt atop this scar. If their records are accurate, they were not at the start of human history. They stood trembling at its reboot. What if history does not begin with Sumer because Sumer marks the aftermath, not the origin? What if their tablets were not drafts of a budding civilization, but the final attempts to salvage knowledge from one that fell? What if the first words humanity ever pressed into clay were not the excited declarations of a species discovering itself, but the solemn vows of survivors determined not to let the world forget? If so, the past may not be what we think it is. The story we call the beginning may actually be the middle of something older, something larger, something we're only now remembering how to hear. When scholars tried to trace the origins of Sumer, they expected to uncover the slow, messy climb that typically marks the rise of human societies: incremental improvements in pottery, the gradual refinement of tools, the emergence of villages turning into towns. But that is not what the soil revealed. Instead of finding modest beginnings, archaeologists encountered something profoundly unsettling. They found a civilization that appeared without warning, fully realized, its systems already functioning as though centuries of forgotten practice had shaped them. There were no clear developmental routes to explain how knowledge had formed, only evidence of knowledge itself, already refined and implemented. The Sumerians claimed they were not inventors. They described themselves as preservers of something older, something transmitted to them, a world that collapsed and was reborn in their hands. To understand why this disrupts our understanding of early humanity, it helps to compare Sumer to other ancient societies. Egypt, for instance, reveals a clear lineage of growth. Archaeologists can trace its cultural development backwards through distinct eras, each layer of artifacts representing a new step in sophistication, from simple farmers to pyramid builders. Every advancement has its roots in something earlier, each innovation a natural extension of the one before it. You can peel back Egyptian civilization like rings of a tree, following its evolution into the past. Yet Sumer does not behave like that. Instead of a ladder, it appears as though someone placed the entire structure at once, leaving nothing to climb. Sumerian temples, for example, were not experimental constructions. They were enormous complexes aligned with astronomical events, designed with mathematical precision from their earliest phases. How did a supposedly primitive people, emerging from the Stone Age, suddenly understand celestial mechanics well enough to embed cosmic order into architecture? Their earliest writing displays mastery of concepts most civilizations take millennia to achieve. Sumer did not stumble into literacy. It commenced with a writing system capable of recording laws, astronomical cycles, economic transactions, and hymns. That is not a tentative beginning. It is a cultural achievement that should have required generations to perfect. Consider their language. It does not seem to belong to any linguistic family. Specialists have tested its structures against Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, and Uralic tongues. None fit. Sumerian stands alone, as though transplanted from an unknown source, complete and functional from its first appearance. If writing systems evolve over time, if languages grow from simpler forms, then why does Sumerian emerge already sophisticated, already layered with symbolic meaning? The Sumerians themselves never claimed to invent it. They wrote that it was given to them, bestowed by a divine intelligence. Their word for this knowledge was me, a term combining the ideas of law, cosmic order, and encoded information. According to them, knowledge did not emerge from human minds. It descended from a realm beyond ordinary perception. Their astronomical understanding is even more bewildering. One tablet documents the orbital cycle of Venus with a precision not matched again until the age of telescopes. Other texts record the positions of Jupiter and Saturn over decades, implying calculations that require far more than naked eye observation. How could a civilization at humanity's alleged origin not only watch the skies but mathematically model celestial cycles? Why do their records contain star charts that reflect constellations we still recognize, aligned with long-term astronomical processes? These questions are not rhetorical. They expose a contradiction at the heart of human origins. Either we misunderstand the Sumerians, or they inherited a scientific tradition older than recorded time. Mathematics deepens the mystery. Their sexagesimal system, based on 60 rather than 10, remains embedded in our measurement of time and angles. Modern humanity still uses Sumerian mathematics every time we navigate, calculate or divide a circle into degrees. Tablets reveal knowledge of square roots, advanced geometry, and number sets that imply trigonometric principles long before Greek mathematicians formalized them. On clay, silent yet undeniable, are calculations that anticipate ideas we assumed belonged exclusively to later ages. This is not what a first civilization looks like. It is what a restored civilization looks like, one operating from memory rather than invention. Their knowledge of medicine demonstrates the same pattern. They recorded anatomical observations, surgical procedures, and botanical treatments that align with modern pharmacology. These tablets describe ailments, symptoms, and remedies in a structured fashion that resembles clinical documentation, not speculative ritual. They indicate systematic study, not mythic speculation. Why would a newborn culture possess medical knowledge so detailed that scholars can recognize parallels in contemporary science? Why does no earlier stage exist to explain its origin? This pattern repeats in metallurgy. Sumerian bronze was not primitive but alloyed with precision, requiring control of heat and access to tin from distant lands. There is no archaeological trail showing incremental development of smelting techniques, only evidence of advanced metalwork appearing abruptly. Civilizations are supposed to learn through failure, but Sumer began with competence. The first bricks of their culture were finished products. When confronted with these anomalies, researchers attempted to dismiss them as coincidences or as gaps in excavation. Perhaps earlier settlements were destroyed by floods. Perhaps time erased humanity's first experiments with writing and measurement. Yet Sumerian texts consistently claim otherwise. They insist that humanity once lived in a unified world, speaking one language, guided by beings of extraordinary capacity, and that something catastrophic fractured that unity. These texts do not whisper origin myths. They declare memories. This brings us to the theme the Sumerians return to again and again, a time before the flood. In their records, civilization is divided into two eras, before and after a devastating deluge. They describe the flood not as metaphor, but as an event so catastrophic it reset knowledge across an entire region. Archaeologists have uncovered thick layers of silt at multiple Mesopotamian sites, deposits that match the time frame and nature of the flood narratives. This sediment separates earlier occupational levels from later Sumerian reconstruction, implying a real disaster that wiped structures clean. What the Sumerians wrote appears to align with what the earth preserved. If the flood was real, then perhaps so was what preceded it. According to the tablets, kings ruled for impossibly long spans of time before the waters came. Knowledge flowed freely, and humanity was guided by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki, figures later reinterpreted through myths and legends, but originally described with startling specificity. To the Sumerians, these weren't intangible deities. They were rulers, judges, teachers, and architects, participant entities who walked among humans and handed down the codes of civilization. They introduced writing, agriculture, city planning, and law, then withdrew, leaving humans to preserve what remained. The idea that civilization was taught rather than invented challenges every assumption about humanity's progression. What if the world before the flood was not primitive but advanced? What if the Sumerians did not rise from ignorance but awakened into memory? What if the cities they built were not experiments in architecture, but reconstructions based on instructions they barely understood? What if their myths encode processes in metaphor because no language existed to relay the complexity literally? Their texts describe creation not as effortless divine speech, but as a sequence of adjustments and failed prototypes. These narratives resemble technical documentation disguised in symbolic storytelling. If early humans observed genetic manipulation, or processes requiring knowledge of biology and refinement, they lacked vocabulary to explain it. They could only translate it into myth, using clay and essence as metaphors because they had no terminology for cells, DNA, or engineering. This interpretation may sound speculative, yet the consistency across cultures is difficult to ignore. Flood myths persist in civilizations separated by oceans. Creation narratives speak of beings descending from the heavens, imparting knowledge and shaping humanity. Either all cultures independently invented the same improbable stories, or they inherited fragments of something older, dispersed by survivors who carried memories to distant lands. The tablets suggest the latter, and archaeology provides the silence in which those memories echo. If Sumer marks not the birth of civilization but its restoration, then our entire timeline shifts. The question ceases to be how the Sumerians achieved so much and become something far more unsettling. Who taught them? Who, or what, handed humanity a functioning framework of language, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and architecture, fully formed, as though reopening a sealed archive? The Sumerians claim they did not create civilization. They insisted it had been given, then lost, then given again. If their tablets are not allegory, if they are memory, then humanity is not a species inventing itself, but a species recovering from amnesia, and every clay tablet, every wedge-shaped mark, every silt layer whispering beneath ancient ruins may be part of the record we were never meant to forget. If the Sumerians inherited knowledge rather than invented it, then something must have existed before them, something capable of shaping a world so advanced that even its remnants appeared fully formed. The Sumerians did not treat their civilization as an innovation. They regarded it as a rebirth, a second version of a world that had fallen into ruin. Their tablets are filled not with pride of discovery, but with the weight of responsibility, as if they were custodians of instructions whose origins they did not fully understand. This sense of obligation permeates everything they left behind. Their laws were not suggestions, their measurements were not approximations, their rituals were not symbolic play. They were continuations of something older, something they believed necessary to maintain balance in a world that could easily collapse again. One of the most telling features of Sumerian culture is its preoccupation with order. They viewed the cosmos as a structured entity that required constant attention. Everything, from the layout of their cities to the daily tasks of their priests, was designed to mirror celestial patterns. Their temples were not just places of worship, they were engines of stability, physical embodiments of a worldview that saw chaos as the natural state of existence. To them, civilization was not guaranteed. It was a fragile construct maintained only by humans, adhering to principles that predated them. This view explains why their entire society revolved around their temples, the ziggurats that towered over their cities like stairways linking heaven and earth. Unlike later religious structures, Sumerian temples were not confined to prayer. They functioned as schools, observatories, administrative centers, banks, and archives. They stored tablets detailing everything from taxes to star positions. They catalogued crop yields, contracts, hymns, and medical prescriptions. The temple was not a house of gods. It was a memory vault, an institution charged with ensuring that knowledge did not disappear again. The priests who maintained these archives were not spiritual intermediaries alone. They were engineers of memory. Their role was to guard information with the same diligence that others guarded treasure. The Sumerians believed that losing knowledge was more dangerous than losing land because land could be reacquired, but a forgotten principle might doom the world to collapse. Knowledge to them was not privilege, it was duty. This sense of guardianship over wisdom may also explain the Sumerian obsession with writing. They did not carve words into clay tablets for artistic expression or entertainment. They wrote because they feared a return to ignorance. In a world haunted by memories of a catastrophe that had erased everything once before, the written word was an anchor, a way of tethering fragile knowledge to something solid. The Sumerians recorded everything precisely because they never wanted to experience a second cultural amnesia. Their understanding of time reflected this fear. Unlike modern societies, which often view time as linear, stretching from past to future, the Sumerians saw it as cyclical. Events, they believed, did not simply happen and then vanish. They repeated, and with repetition came both opportunity and danger. Civilizations could rise again. They could also fall again. The future was not distant. It was a loop, waiting for memory to reawaken or vanish. Their kingship system embodies this worldview. Rulers did not seize power, they received it. Kingship, according to Sumerian inscriptions, descended from the heavens, meaning it was not a human invention. Authority did not emerge from political dominance, it was bestowed by a source outside human control. Kings were not leaders by virtue of strength, they were custodians chosen to manage a contract older than themselves. If a king failed in this role, the world risked unraveling. The kingship lists preserved by the Sumerians describe rulers living for staggering periods, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of years. Modern historians dismiss these lifespans as symbolic exaggeration, but the Sumerians did not treat them as metaphors. To them, the world before the flood was not simply different in structure, it was different in nature. Time flowed differently. Humanity functioned differently. These eras were not fantasy to them, they were memory. Even after the flood, rulers did not govern as independent agents. They acted under the watch of divine laws, not because the gods demanded loyalty, but because those laws preserved order. Break the pattern, and the world could collapse. Restarting civilization was not about building cities, it was about restoring structure. Any lapse could repeat the catastrophe. But how did the Sumerians acquire such elaborate systems from the start? Their texts attribute these gifts to beings they called the Anunnaki. Later cultures reinterpreted these figures as gods, but the original Sumerian understanding is more complex. The Anunnaki were depicted as instructors rather than creators, as if they were restoring knowledge, not initiating it. They are described teaching humans how to build, farm, measure, and govern. They establish tasks and give humans the means to carry them out. Rather than mythic beings dispensing blessings, they resemble overseers ensuring that civilization meets certain criteria. The Sumerians believed that the Anunnaki's withdrawal marked the beginning of human autonomy, but autonomy did not mean freedom. It meant responsibility. Humans were now required to maintain order themselves. If they forgot how, chaos would triumph. The Sumerians internalized this fear so deeply that their writing, architecture, rituals, and social systems became shields against oblivion. This raises a disquieting question. Why would any group devote such effort to preserving knowledge unless they knew how easily it could vanish? Something must have taught them this lesson. Something traumatic enough to haunt generations. The flood provides one explanation, but the scale of their fear hints that the flood was not merely natural disaster, it was erasure. If the Sumerians inherited civilization from a previous age, that earlier world must have fallen so completely that only fragments remained. The survivors, whether human or something else, must have scrambled to salvage what they could. The Sumerians were the ones who succeeded in stabilizing those remnants, embedding them into clay before time stripped them away. Their tablets were not inventions, they were rescue operations. Their myths reflect this salvage mentality. They are filled with beings who shape and reshape humanity, adjusting designs, correcting flaws, restarting experiments. These stories resemble engineering more than theology. They read like translations of complex processes, reduced into symbols comprehensible to a society that no longer possessed the language of the originals. When a scribe writes of divine hands mixing clay and breath to form humans, he's not describing metaphysical creation. He's describing something he cannot name because the vocabulary for it has been lost. This distinction becomes clearer when Sumerian myths are compared with those of other ancient civilizations. The themes are eerily consistent. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia describe beings descending from the sky, teaching humans sacred knowledge and shaping the world through law and instruction. They speak of a time before humans understood mortality, when lifespan was not a fixed measure. They recount a cataclysm that reset human existence, followed by a period of reconstruction. These are not coincidence, they're resonance. The implications reach far beyond the Sumerians. If so many cultures recall the same structure of history, then either humanity is predisposed to invent similar myths, or these stories reflect real memories distributed long before recorded time. The Sumerians appear closest to the source, their accounts less distorted by reinterpretation. What later cultures mythologized, the Sumerians documented. Their tablets do not tremble with wonder, they speak with clarity. To them, the past was not unknowable, it was simply out of reach. They did not speculate, they remembered. But memory can survive only so long. It requires constant reinforcement. The Sumerians knew this better than any society that followed them. Their civilization did not collapse for lack of brilliance. It collapsed because memory eroded. As new generations rose, fewer understood the reasons behind the rituals. Systems built to preserve knowledge continued to function, but their purpose faded. Form remained, meaning evaporated. Once the thread snapped, nothing could repair it. This loss of context is not a Sumerian phenomenon. It is a human one. Civilizations built atop foundations they do not understand eventually forget the significance of those foundations. What begins as necessity becomes habit, then superstition, then irrelevance. Once the sequence completes, collapse is inevitable. Sumer shows what happens when a society awakens not at the dawn of civilization, but in its twilight. They caught the dying embers of an earlier world and preserved them for a while, but embers cannot burn forever. Their achievements were not the rise of humanity. They were the afterglow of something extinguished. If modern humanity is indeed another cycle in this series of rise and fall, then our position becomes clearer and more precarious. We build languages we do not trace, technologies we do not fully understand, and systems that seem to operate on laws older than our comprehension. We believe we are inventing. Perhaps we are remembering. And if we are remembering, then there must be something to remember. The Sumerians tried to ensure we would not forget. Their tablets endure not because they were important to them, but because they believed they were necessary for us. Their message has not changed. Civilization is not guaranteed. Knowledge is not immortal. Forgetting is not passive. It is catastrophic. And once it begins, it does not break gently. If the Sumerians stood at the threshold of a world rebuilt from fragments, then the question of where those fragments came from presses harder with each tablet deciphered. They did not describe a humanity struggling upward from simplicity, but a humanity recovering from devastation. Their kings did not appear as ambitious men fighting for dominance, but as custodians tasked with stabilizing a blueprint older than themselves. Their architecture did not evolve through trial and error, but emerged fully conceptualized as if drawn from memory rather than invention. Everything about their civilization suggests continuity, not commencement, and this alone challenges the bedrock of modern historical interpretation. A world that begins advanced implies that something advanced preceded it. When archaeologists unearthed the earlier cities of Sumer, they expected small settlements, rough shelters, and scattered tribal remains. Instead, they discovered urban infrastructure, straight streets aligned along cardinal directions, drainage systems more efficient than many medieval designs, monumental temples serving as administrative hubs, and standardized bricks indicating a central authority overseeing production. Behind each of these accomplishments lay a set of principles too refined for a society supposedly taking its first steps into civilization. Irrigation networks channeled rivers with mathematical precision, ensuring consistent harvests across vast expanses of land. Agriculture did not grow from scattered pastoral communities. It appeared structured and deliberate, with crop rotation, granaries, and assigned labor governed by already established rules. Trade networks fanned out from Sumerian cities, reaching places thousands of miles away. Lapis lazuli from distant mountains, timber from forests beyond their horizon, copper from lands no Sumerian was known to have explored, all arrived in their marketplaces. This indicates not only a knowledge of geography, but an understanding of supply chains, logistics, and regulated commerce. People do not create complex trade relationships spontaneously. They evolve them over centuries. Yet the Sumerians operated these networks as if they were heirs to paths already known, as though someone had marked the roads long before their cities took shape. These behaviors do not represent a society learning how to be civilized. They represent a society attempting to re-establish something it had once known but partially forgotten. In this light, the Sumerians' emphasis on writing becomes clearer. Writing is not only a means of communication, it is a hedge against forgetting. It captures details that living memory cannot hold indefinitely. The Sumerians seem to have understood the fragility of knowledge deeply enough to embed it into clay itself. They did not trust memory alone. Memory had failed once already. Their mythology reinforces this conviction. To later civilizations, myths were stories, symbolic truths wrapped in metaphor. To the Sumerians, myths were recollections locked in poetic imagery because the original terminology no longer existed. Their accounts of beings descending from the heavens read less like religious dogma and more like historical narrative. They described these entities in practical terms, identifying them by role rather than worship. These beings possess specific functions, measuring time, assigning laws, dividing land, teaching sciences. Gods did not rule for glory. They administered tasks. Their presence did not justify faith. It justified order. This understanding stands in stark contrast to later religious traditions, where gods became cosmic overseers or moral judges. In Sumer, gods were managers of civilization, and humans participated in their systems because survival depended on cooperation. Rituals were not acts of flattery, but acts of maintenance. Lose the ritual, and lose the world. Ceremonies were calibrations, not supplications. This worldview bled into every facet of Sumerian life. Their city plans followed celestial patterns. Their legal codes mirrored cycles of nature, emphasizing equilibrium rather than punishment. Their economies functioned like organisms, each part serving the whole. Theirs was not an improvisational culture discovering new possibilities. It was a memory-based culture guarding against dissolution. They did not approach existence as explorers. They approached it as caretakers afraid of repeating a catastrophe they barely understood. The flood narrative encapsulates this fear. The Sumerians never framed the flood as divine retribution for moral failure, as many later traditions did. For them, the flood represented the collapse of order. It was not a punishment, it was a reset. Something destabilized the balance that held civilization together, and nature, or something using nature, swept the slate clean. The flood marks the boundary between a world where order was imposed by higher authorities and a world where humans inherited responsibility. Everything after the flood was reconstruction. Reconstruction explains why Sumerian knowledge feels simultaneously advanced and incomplete. Their mathematics contain brilliance but lack theoretical foundations. Their astronomy reveals patterns we still use, but omits explanations for how those patterns were discovered. Their medicine identifies symptoms accurately yet rarely explains cause. Their language expresses nuance yet supports ideas foreign to later civilizations. Their myths preserve sequences of events, but obscure context. Theirs was not a culture inventing from scratch. It was a culture that remembered enough to replicate without fully understanding. This phenomenon becomes more pronounced when Sumerian texts are juxtaposed with later traditions that inherited fragments of their worldview. The Hebrews, Babylonians, Greeks, and Persians all adapted Sumerian concepts, often without understanding their origins. Laws became commandments rather than instructions. Rituals became morality rather than mechanics. Gods became supreme entities rather than administrators. Each reinterpretation diluted the original intent, transforming maintenance procedures into belief systems. By the time history reached the classical world, memory had decayed into mythology. When civilizations remember imperfectly, they reconstruct incorrectly. Foundations shift, structures wobble, and collapse becomes inevitable. Sumer's successors inherited pieces of a puzzle without the picture. Their achievements could not sustain themselves indefinitely because they lacked the context required to protect what they built. Without context, innovation becomes mimicry, and mimicry can only endure so long. The Sumerians, however, still retained enough clarity to preserve the framework. This does not mean they understood every component. It means they understood enough to keep the world functioning. Their rituals were maintenance protocols. Their kingship was an assigned role. Their gods were supervisors. Their tablets were archives. Their cities were fortresses of memory. Even their art reflects this mentality. Human figures stand stiff, eyes wide, hands clasped, not in ecstatic devotion but in solemn attention, as though witnessing something immense and irreversible. Perhaps the most striking example of this mentality lies in their treatment of death. To the Sumerians, death was not a mystery. It was a transition governed by structure rather than moral judgment. The afterlife was not a place of reward or punishment, but a continuation of existence under different rules. This view reveals a society not concerned with pleasing gods, but with obeying laws embedded in reality. Death was not a threat but a constant, a reminder that existence itself was governed by forces humanity did not control. Where later cultures layered spiritual meaning onto mortality, the Sumerians treated it like another function of the system they had inherited. This systems-based worldview suggests that the Sumerians did not perceive themselves as the authors of civilization, but as its operators. They managed knowledge that predated them, attempting to keep it from fading again. If they had truly been the originators, their achievements would show a gradual sharpening of clarity. Instead, they arrived at a plateau and held it for as long as they could. Their decline demonstrates what happens when maintenance outlasts understanding. Once the reasons behind the systems became opaque, collapse was unavoidable. The erosion of knowledge did not happen as a dramatic event. It crept in slowly, generation by generation. At first, priests could explain why a ritual mattered, how it aligned with a celestial event or regulated social balance. Later, priests could recite procedures, but not their purpose. Eventually, rituals became tradition, remembered but misunderstood. When purpose is lost, discipline withers, and when discipline falters, systems crumble. Sumer's fall was not a battle, it was a forgetting. Modern humanity stands in a similar position. Our technologies far outpace our comprehension. We build machines capable of computations no single mind can follow. We manipulate atoms without fully understanding consequences. We explore the cosmos guided by mathematics whose origins we no longer question. We assume we're advancing because our tools improve, yet we rarely examine the foundations beneath them. We might be repeating the Sumerian trajectory without realizing it. If knowledge is not invention but inheritance, then our innovations are restorations, fragments of something older resurfacing through intuition, curiosity, or unconscious memory. We call these breakthroughs, but they might be recollections. We marvel at ideas that appear suddenly, as if pulled from nowhere, but nowhere may not be empty. It may be memory's shadow waiting to take form. Perhaps humanity does not progress linearly because it is not designed to progress. Perhaps it cycles, gaining knowledge until it can no longer maintain or comprehend it, then collapsing into darkness before rising again. Each cycle retains traces of the previous one, enough to rebuild, but never enough to fully understand. The Sumerians existed early enough in the cycle to remember fragments clearly. We exist late enough to mistake memory for genius. History may not be a story of ascent. It may be a story of recovery. If that is true, then the Sumerians were not a beginning. They were a warning not to forget, a warning not to mistake inheritance for originality, a warning that knowledge without understanding cannot save a civilization. And if the past is cyclical, then we are not moving toward the unknown. We are returning to it. If the Sumerians stood on the edge of memory rather than invention, then every aspect of their civilization can be seen as a translation, a reinterpretation of concepts that originated somewhere deeper in the human past. This raises an unsettling implication. What if human history does not chart the ascent of intelligence, but its repeated decline? What if the trajectory we call progress is merely the resurfacing of ideas once commonplace, fragments of a world so distant that even myth cannot describe it fully? The Sumerians preserved what they could, not because they sought to glorify themselves, but because they feared the consequences of ignorance. They knew what forgetting could cost, because forgetting had ended something vast before they arrived. That fear is carved into every tablet they left behind, a silent message intended not for their contemporaries, but for anyone who might one day rediscover their archives. The stories they recorded do not read like legends born from imagination. They read like explanations for remnants that no longer made sense. Their gods do not behave like divine abstractions. They act more like custodians of technology, issuing decrees, enforcing boundaries and regulating practices that appear procedural rather than spiritual. Their worlds are populated with beings who construct, assign roles and maintain order, as if their universe was a system built to specifications. The Sumerians did not imagine the cosmos as an accident. They saw it as engineered. Cities were designed the same way. They were not artistic expressions evolving across centuries. They were operational nodes, aligned with celestial patterns as though the heavens themselves dictated their architecture. This alignment was not symbolic. It was functional. Star movements and planetary cycles determined festivals, planting schedules, tax deadlines, even royal authority. Time became a dimension of governance, not a philosophical concept. Days and months were not human conventions. They were reflections of calculated patterns designed to manage resources and maintain equilibrium. The Sumerians did not impose structure on nature. They synchronized with it. Their understanding of cosmic order shaped their relationships with each other. Social roles existed not because of power dynamics, but because specific functions were required to maintain the system. Farmers, priests, rulers, craftsmen, each fulfilled a part of what the Sumerians believed civilization needed to survive. These were not professions chosen freely. They were obligations. One did not pursue a calling. One assumed a position. In their worldview, individual ambition meant little. The collective responsibility to preserve knowledge mattered far more. This system allowed Sumer to thrive for centuries, but it also limited it. A society built on maintenance eventually stagnates, because preservation alone cannot produce innovation. Once the Sumerians had secured the essential structures of their world, they did not advance beyond them. They refined processes, but they did not transcend them. Their greatest achievements, therefore, may not be what they built, but what they remembered. They were conscious of living in a world that was not theirs, holding on to memories they did not fully understand, maintaining traditions whose origins lay beyond their reach. They acted not as authors of civilization, but as stewards of something inherited. This inheritance is most apparent in their mythology concerning creation. Unlike later belief systems, which describe creation as a sudden, effortless act of divine will, the Sumerians speak of trial, error, and correction. Humanity was formed and reformed, mixed with ingredients whose nature the scribes could not name, refined until it met the necessary criteria. These are not the gestures of gods creating playfully. They resemble protocols, as if existence required tuning. Such narratives imply a process rather than a miracle, procedure rather than poetry. The world was not spoken into existence, it was calibrated. The flood narrative reinforces this theme. The deluge appears not as a punishment, but as a reboot. Something destabilized the balance that governed civilization, and the system responded not with moral judgment, but with catastrophic correction. The flood was not the wrath of divinity, it was the failure of regulation. Afterward, those who survived had to reconstruct the world without the clarity that once guided them. The Sumerians inherited the responsibility to restore order, piecing together systems whose original purpose was known only through fragments. That responsibility weighed heavily on them. Their rituals resemble maintenance tasks, actions necessary to uphold agreements made long before human memory. Their kings acted as regulators, ensuring processes remained aligned with cosmic principles. Their gods supervised tasks rather than intervening whimsically. Nothing in their worldview suggests spontaneity. Everything existed because it served a role. If a role was abandoned, consequences followed, not because of displeased gods, but because reality itself unraveled without structure. Over time, those structures degraded. The Sumerians recorded more than they understood, and each generation lost a little more of the underlying logic. Rituals performed by priests who once knew their purpose gradually became symbolic gestures. Cities aligned with constellations became ceremonial centers rather than functional observatories. The Anunnaki, once described as administrators, became revered as distant gods. The more people forgot, the more divine their past became. This is how memory transforms into myth, not through invention, but through erosion. When Sumer declined, it did not do so abruptly. It dissolved slowly as understanding faded. Other civilizations inherited pieces of their knowledge, but without the conceptual framework to sustain it. Babylonians extended Sumerian astronomy, yet reinterpreted celestial mechanics as omens. Egyptians built monumental architecture, yet used different cosmological models. Hebrews retained fragments of creation myths, yet transformed procedural narratives into moral decrees. Each successor altered the meaning of what they inherited, moving further from memory and closer to imagination. This transformation reveals an uncomfortable truth about human civilization. We do not lose knowledge because it disappears. We lose it because it becomes irrelevant to people who no longer understand its purpose. The Sumerians created systems meant to endure forever, but permanence requires comprehension. Without it, even the most sophisticated framework becomes unstable. Culture becomes ritual. Ritual becomes myth. Myth becomes story. Story becomes superstition, and superstition cannot preserve what it does not understand. This pattern may still be unfolding. Humanity today marvels at technology it barely comprehends, uses devices it cannot build, and follows digital systems no single mind fully grasps. Our world is interconnected through networks whose complexity exceeds individual understanding. We assume such complexity represents progress, yet complexity without comprehension looks eerily like the late stage of a cycle. The Sumerians lived in the early echo of a forgotten world. We may be living in the late echo of a remembered one. If so, then our fascination with ancient civilizations may not be curiosity. It may be instinct. Perhaps we study Sumer not because we want to know where we came from, but because we sense where we are headed. The collapse of understanding does not announce itself. It unfolds silently, disguised as stability. The Sumerians preserved knowledge until they could not. We create knowledge faster than we can explain it. Their world ended because memory eroded. Ours risks ending because comprehension cannot keep pace. Still, there is a difference between forgetting passively and forgetting deliberately. The Sumerians tried to resist the former. They embedded their knowledge into clay, the most durable medium they possessed. Their tablets survived floods, fires, dynastic collapse, and millennia of neglect. They endure not because they were meant for their time, but because they were written for another. They were messages to the future, warnings encoded in symbols whose meaning would outlast memory. Their existence implies that the Sumerians believed someone would eventually rediscover what they could not hold on to. The rediscovery has begun. Modern researchers have excavated countless tablets, deciphered languages that once seemed indecipherable, reconstructed cities long abandoned, and traced astronomical systems that mirror our own. Yet for all our advances, we remain no closer to understanding why the Sumerians believed knowledge was dangerous to forget. We accept that they built, wrote, and ruled, but we avoid the question that matters most. What exactly were they trying so hard to preserve? Perhaps the answer is not hidden in what they said, but in what they assumed. They did not debate whether civilization required structure. They accepted it as truth. They did not argue about humanity's purpose. They believed humanity had one. They did not ponder whether gods existed. They knew someone had handed down the framework of existence. Their certainty reflects not conviction, but memory. They were not theorizing about origins. They were recalling them. If their memories are accurate, then humanity's origins lie not in random evolution, but in intentional design. Our world may not be the first iteration of civilization, nor the last. We may be remnants of an experiment older than writing itself, and when we examine Sumerian clay tablets, we may not be studying the dawn of history. We may be reading the after-action reports of survivors. Their desperation to write everything down suggests they feared another collapse. Their emphasis on ritual maintenance indicates they believed civilization required constant calibration. Their reverence for their ancestors implies they saw themselves as latecomers in a story already ancient. If they were correct, then our species is not young. It is amnesiac. We believe we are exploring the unknown. It is more likely we are rediscovering the familiar. We call it innovation, but innovation may be remembering. We celebrate progress, but progress may be repetition. And the mysteries we attribute to the supernatural may be artifacts of a forgotten science. Sumer was not the beginning, it was the first reminder, and reminders only exist when something important has already been forgotten. If the Sumerians were echoes of an earlier age, then we must ask whether humanity today is living through the same cycle, walking paths laid down before us without realizing their origin. Our world, like theirs, is filled with knowledge whose foundations we barely comprehend. We treat technology as triumph, yet most people who use it cannot explain how it functions. We accept systems that operate beyond individual understanding, confident in their stability because they seem too vast to fail. This confidence mirrors the Sumerian assumption that their world would continue as long as rituals were maintained. They could not imagine collapse, not because it was impossible, but because forgetting was invisible until it was complete. Their civilization unraveled quietly, not with explosions, but with questions that no one could answer. As the Sumerians faded, those who succeeded them inherited fragments stripped of meaning. Their gods became mythic heroes, their rituals became ceremonial habit, their sciences became stories. The further history drifted from Sumer, the more distorted the original concepts became. What had once been practical knowledge hardened into symbolic tradition. People repeated words they no longer understood. Languages evolved, stories merged, and events once concrete dissolved into allegory. The Sumerians were not remembered for what they preserved, but for what later generations forgot. The remnants of their world survived only because clay endures. Stone crumbles, papyrus decays, memory evaporates. But clay, fired in the furnaces of time, remains. Their tablets lay buried beneath dust and ruin for thousands of years, waiting for a species that could decipher them. When modern archaeologists uncovered these records, they expected primitive ideas. Instead, they found complexity beyond expectation. Yet even now, scholars struggle to interpret the meanings behind those tablets. Understanding the script is not the same as understanding the world it describes. Words can be read without being grasped. This disconnect mirrors the Sumerians' own predicament. They inherited knowledge they could replicate but not expand. They could perform tasks but not explain origins. They built cities as their ancestors had done, yet lacked the context that had once made those cities essential. When rituals no longer aligned with their purpose, systems collapsed from within. The physical world remained for a time, but the conceptual world disintegrated. Without meaning, function decays. Without comprehension, structure becomes burden. It is tempting to believe we have escaped this fate because our world appears more advanced. We wield machines that reach beyond the planet, crack atoms, and map the invisible. But advancement without understanding is not immunity. It is fragility. Humanity now depends on knowledge distributed across networks too complex for any single mind to hold. We trust our world the same way the Sumerians trusted theirs, because it works. But functioning systems are not eternal. They demand maintenance, and maintenance requires comprehension. What if our confidence blinds us to the erosion already underway? Languages simplify, attention spans shorten, and systems automate tasks once requiring expertise. People rely on machines whose workings they cannot articulate. We archive information in digital formats vulnerable to collapse. Our knowledge is vast, yet dispersed, fragile, and increasingly dependent on technology rather than memory. The Sumerians feared forgetting because they had seen what forgetting caused. We do not fear it because we assume technology will protect us. But technology does not prevent forgetting. It accelerates it. Once machines remember for us, we cease to remember ourselves. Perhaps this is the true lesson hidden within Sumerian history. They did not vanish because enemies conquered them, or because nature betrayed them. They vanished because memory faded until nothing remained to hold the world together. Their fall was quiet, slow, inevitable. It unfolded not in war, but in neglect. No one noticed until it was too late. By the time memory dies, no one remembers what has been lost. The parallels between Sumer and our present are not coincidences. They are symptoms of a repeating condition. Civilizations do not collapse when they run out of resources. They collapse when they run out of reasons. When knowledge becomes ritual, when systems outlast explanations, when people obey without understanding, collapse becomes a matter of time. The Sumerians tried to forestall this death through writing. They etched memory into clay because they feared reliance on oral tradition. They built physical archives in the hope that someone someday would find them and remember. Their tablets are not relics, they are warnings. What if those warnings were not intended for us alone? What if each cycle of civilization leaves messages for the next, hoping to break the pattern? Sumer may have been the most recent attempt before ours. If so, then we face a choice those ancient scribes anticipated. Either we learn from their failure, or we repeat it. The question is not whether humanity will forget. The question is whether we will notice it happening. Our fascination with the ancient world may be more than academic interest. It may be instinctual recognition. Something in us senses that the past contains truth we once possessed. We search ruins not merely to understand ancestors, but to understand ourselves. We look for beginnings because something tells us that our current trajectory does not explain us. We are not satisfied with the story of gradual development from crude origins, because the evidence contradicts that story. Our intelligence is disproportionate to our history. Our abilities exceed our explanations. We know more than we should for a species allegedly born from nothing. Maybe we did not invent civilization. Maybe civilization is our inheritance, passed down after each collapse. Each time a world ends, fragments survive. Some fragments become myths. Some become symbols. Some become warnings. The Sumerians preserved more fragments than any other civilization we know, but even they could not preserve everything. They remembered enough to rebuild the world, but not enough to sustain it forever. They were custodians of memory, not creators of meaning. The fact that we now rediscover their tablets suggests that their message has reached its destination. We are the audience they hoped for, the ones who might understand what they never fully could. The clay preserved what human minds could not hold indefinitely. If we ignore their message, then we choose ignorance consciously, and the outcome will be ours to bear. Imagine that the world as we know it is not the first. Imagine that civilizations rise, peak, and crumble, leaving traces behind for the next iteration. Each cycle advances until memory collapses under its own weight. The survivors emerge confused, inherit remnants they cannot decode, and rebuild based on instinct rather than comprehension. Myths form, religions emerge, and history begins again. Not from zero, but from fragments. Over time, fragments become foundations, foundations become structures, and structures become civilizations. Then forgetting resumes, and the cycle restarts. The Sumerians may have been closer to the previous cycle's end than we are. Their clarity of memory exceeded ours, but even they did not understand everything. Their stories hint at knowledge lost long before their time. They did not see themselves as the beginning, but as the pale reflection of something greater. Their world was not young, it was inherited. They preserved it as long as they could, then watched it fade. We stand in a position tragically similar, yet with one advantage they lacked. We recognize the pattern, we see the parallels. We have unearthed their warnings and begun to decipher them. Whether we act on that knowledge remains uncertain. Perhaps our modern fascination with ancient civilizations is not nostalgia but instinctual preparation. We search ruins because we anticipate ruin. We study beginnings because ours may be ending. And yet, if humanity is caught in a repeating cycle, then the cycle itself holds meaning. Each iteration is not punishment but reminder. We forget because we fail to comprehend the importance of remembering. The Sumerians carved into clay because they understood that human memory is fallible. They trusted the earth more than their minds. Their words endure because clay endures. Perhaps we too must decide what deserves permanence. Not everything should be preserved, but some things cannot be lost without consequence. If knowledge is indeed inheritance, then inheritance is responsibility. The Sumerians passed their burden to us. The question now is whether we will continue the chain or break it. Breaking it means collapse. Continuing it means remembering. Maybe that is why their tablets still speak, not in sentences but in presence. Their survival across millennia is itself a message. The past does not disappear. It sleeps, it waits, it listens, and when someone digs deep enough, it wakes. In the end, the Sumerians were not trying to convince anyone of their greatness. They were trying to leave a light on, a light that might one day guide a species walking blindly into its own forgetting. That light has reached us. Whether we choose to follow it is the story we are writing now. If history is cyclical, then we stand not at the peak of progress, but at a familiar threshold. The same one the Sumerians once crossed, the same one countless civilizations may have faced before them. Their words still echo through clay. Do not forget. Remember what came before. Remember that you are not the first. Remember that knowledge is not invention, but inheritance. Remember that losing meaning is losing everything. Memory is the only barrier against oblivion, and oblivion always waits. If the Sumerians were not the first to build, write, or think in structured patterns, then perhaps the question we should ask is not what they knew, but why they were chosen as the custodians of knowledge in the first place. What conditions allowed their fragment of the ancient cycle to take root when countless others may have dissolved into dust? Civilizations do not emerge randomly. They require catalysts. Something must occur in the human psyche, in the landscape, or in the fabric of time itself to trigger the reconstruction of order. The emergence of Sumer may have been less an accident and more a response, as though humanity instinctively moved to rebuild once the remnants of the old world were scattered. The impulse to preserve, to systematize, to categorize, appears suddenly in this region, as if a dormant memory awakened. Perhaps it began long before the first brick of Uruk was laid. Perhaps survivors of an earlier epoch wandered across landscapes stripped of meaning, carrying intangible memories, intuition without explanation, habits without origin, fears without context. These survivors may not have understood what they remembered, but instincts guided them. They may have gravitated toward places resonant with something familiar. Southern Mesopotamia, a region shaped by rivers whose courses seem to pulse like veins across the land, may have been one such place. The meeting of the Euphrates and Tigris offered resources, yes, but also something subtler: patterns, flow, division, renewal. These rivers carve the earth the same way minds carve knowledge. They define borders, create fertility, yet demand respect. A people seeking stability would naturally settle where nature already draws lines. In this environment, memory could take shape again. Patterns etched into human minds may have resurfaced, not as recollection, but as compulsion. Without realizing why, they built walls aligned to cardinal directions. Without understanding their origin, they recorded numbers in base 60. Without knowing the reason, they tracked the heavens. These actions to them may have felt intuitive. To us they seem miraculous. But intuition is often memory wearing a different name. One might imagine the first generation after the flood wandering in disarray, unable to interpret the fragments left behind. Their descendants, however, may have begun to piece together stray remnants, an artifact here, a symbol there, stories of beings who once walked among humans, who brought order where chaos reigned. These tales, passed from mouth to mouth, became seeds. Eventually someone pressed reed into clay, not to invent writing, but to prevent the story from degrading further. Everything that followed became scaffolding built around a memory no one fully understood anymore. From this vantage, Sumer becomes not a birthplace, but a convergence. It was not luck that made them the first civilization we recognize. It was inevitability. Their geography, their environment, their psychological inheritance, all coerced them into repeating ancient patterns. Civilization is not created by choice. It is summoned by necessity. Where chaos dominates, order seeks expression. The Sumerians did not craft civilization from void. They shaped it from echoes. As their society evolved, the impulse to maintain grew stronger. They catalogued, measured, and recorded as though driven by a force greater than survival. Writing became an act of defiance against oblivion. Each tablet told the universe, "We remember. We will not let the world collapse again." Their architecture reflected this same resistance. Ziggurats rose not to impress the gods, but to anchor humanity. Each stone was a declaration of existence. To lose a ritual, a story, a calculation, was to lose a fragment of the past. Once enough fragments disappeared, the entire structure risked collapse. Yet, even as they preserved, the Sumerians sensed their limitations. Their myths carry undertones of resignation, as though they knew the task was temporary. They often refer to the heavens not as unattainable realms, but as places abandoned. Something had withdrawn. Something once present no longer intervened. In their stories, humanity is left behind, not forsaken, but released. It is a subtle distinction. Abandonment implies betrayal. Release implies completion. Whatever had guided the ancient world no longer found purpose in direct involvement. Humanity had been given tools and then left to navigate alone. The absence of direct guidance may explain why Sumer never advanced beyond preservation. They lacked the consciousness that had built the world before them. They held instructions, not comprehension. Imagine inheriting a machine without knowing its purpose. You can operate it, maintain it, perhaps even repair parts. But without understanding why it exists, you cannot improve it. The Sumerians lived inside such a machine, the blueprint of civilization, without access to the mind that designed it. Over time, this condition created a kingdom suspended between clarity and confusion. Their achievements remained impressive, but their trajectory stagnated. Their sciences plateaued, their myths calcified, their authority shifted from knowledge to ritual, and ritual eventually outlived reason. The system faltered not because it was flawed, but because humans had exhausted the parts they understood. Once the unknown outweighed the known, the collapse began, not with violence, but with silence. What followed was predictable. Other civilizations emerged, each inheriting fragments of Sumer's memory. Akkad assimilated Sumerian administration. Babylon adopted its astronomical systems. Egypt borrowed its cosmology. The Hebrews inherited its narratives. Greece reinterpreted fragments through philosophy. Each culture carried forward pieces of a puzzle whose central image had already faded. The Sumerians did not vanish because their world was unimportant. They vanished because they succeeded too well at preserving what others later misapplied. The real paradox is not that Sumer fell, it is that humanity continues to rebuild civilizations using templates inherited from them. Our cities remain structured around central authority. Our measurements still rely on Sumerian units. Our timekeeping echoes their sexagesimal system. Even our religious concepts retain shadows of Sumerian cosmology. We believe we create, when in truth we replicate. We design governments, currencies, and calendars as though we are discovering them for the first time, yet these frameworks are older than history. We have merely changed the symbols. If this cycle is repeated before, then perhaps it repeats until a civilization comprehends the origin of its inheritance. The Sumerians remembered enough to rebuild, but not enough to transcend. Their successors innovated without knowing the foundations beneath them. Modern humanity modifies the world without understanding the architecture of reality. We accelerate blindly. Advancement becomes the momentum of forgetting, innovation without reflection, expansion without purpose. What would it mean for a civilization to reach the point of recognition, to see its inheritance not as mythology, but as legacy? Such a civilization would not merely rebuild, it would reconnect. It would search not for new heights, but for lost depths. It would not ask what must be done, but why the world functions as it does. This shift, from operation to comprehension, may be the missing variable of every previous cycle. Sumer hints at the existence of such potential. Their texts contain cryptic references to knowledge withheld, destinations unreachable, heavens once walked by beings no longer present. These hints suggest that humanity once possessed access to something profound, something that vanished when the flood cleansed the world. The Sumerians were not granted that access. They were given the aftermath. They were entrusted with memory, not meaning. Perhaps each cycle grants humanity another opportunity to reclaim meaning. The Sumerians failed not because they were incapable, but because the pieces they inherited were insufficient. Their world lacked the catalyst required to ignite comprehension. They guarded memory, but memory alone cannot evolve. It preserves without transforming. Transformation requires understanding, and understanding requires confronting origins. Modern humanity stands closer to this confrontation than any civilization before us. Our tools extend perception beyond physical senses. Our sciences decipher patterns invisible to ancient minds. Our archives contain more knowledge than the Sumerians could imagine. Yet knowledge without perspective is dangerous. It grows without direction, expanding like vines across ruins, obscuring what lies beneath. The Sumerians may have foreseen this danger. Their warnings echo through their works. Do not forget. But remembering is not enough. One must understand what is worth remembering and why. Without context, memory becomes mythology. Without purpose, progress becomes entropy. The Sumerians preserved the world long enough for another civilization to inherit it. They did not know whether that civilization would succeed where they failed. Their task ended with survival. Ours begins with insight. If cycles continue until meaning is restored, then humanity now may be approaching a decision point. Either we break the cycle by recognizing it, or we descend once more into forgetting. The Sumerians stood at the beginning of this iteration, whispering across millennia, hoping someone would hear them. We have heard them. Whether we listen is another matter. A world that does not understand itself cannot endure. Systems collapse not from external force, but from internal ignorance. When the structure of existence becomes fragile beneath the weight of unexamined assumptions, collapse becomes the only outcome. The Sumerians left us enough to rebuild. They did not leave enough to comprehend. The missing pieces may lie not in their tablets, but in our willingness to question the foundations of our story. Perhaps the greatest myth is the belief that history progresses. Perhaps history circles, returning to the same junction until humanity recognizes the path forward. The Sumerians were not ancient. They were recent. Their shadow stretches over every civilization that followed. Their legacy is not in their fall, but in the questions they left unanswered. Those questions are no longer theirs. They are ours. And if we fail to pursue them, then we too will become a fragment for the next cycle to decipher. If Sumer was not the origin of civilization, but merely the first visible remnant of something older, then the space between cycles becomes the most mysterious period of all. It is a void in our collective memory, a silent gulf where knowledge dissolves and meaning evaporates. No monuments stand in that void, no myths describe it clearly, and no artifacts bear witness to it. It is the moment when the world forgets itself and begins again. The Sumerians occupied the first edge of that new dawn, but the twilight before it, what came immediately after the previous collapse, remains hidden behind veils of time. If we could understand that moment of transition, we might understand why cycles repeat, why civilizations rise not from novelty but from recollection. Perhaps the world before Sumer did not end in fire or violence, but in something far more subtle, a loss of coherence. Civilizations do not always collapse because they are conquered or destroyed. Sometimes they decay from within, as meaning drains from their foundations and complexity overwhelms comprehension. Imagine a world so advanced that its people no longer understood the principles that governed it. Machines might have operated without explanation. Systems might have persisted through habit alone. Rituals may have outlived purpose. The moment knowledge ceases to be understood, it becomes indistinguishable from superstition, regardless of how advanced it once was. In that moment, civilization fractures. When people no longer know why something works, only that it does, they become caretakers rather than creators. Eventually, a caretaker cannot maintain what a creator once designed. The system breaks, slowly at first, then catastrophically. Structures crumble, records decay, stories transform into metaphors. Once enough clarity is lost, the world resets, leaving only fragments to seed the next cycle. The Sumerians inherited those fragments. They awakened in a world still echoing with the ghost of something older, and they spent generations trying to interpret those echoes. It may be that humanity possesses a kind of deep memory, not housed in stories or symbols, but in instincts. We invent agriculture almost simultaneously across continents. We align structures to celestial events without apparent communication. We conceive gods that resemble administrators rather than omnipotent beings. Such parallels do not reflect coincidence. They reflect inheritance. The subconscious remembers what the conscious mind forgets. The Sumerians externalized that subconscious memory in clay, but other civilizations held it in ritual, architecture, myth, and art. We call such similarities cultural diffusion, but diffusion requires contact. What if contact was not necessary because the memory was already there? To imagine such memory, one must accept that knowledge may not always arise from observation, but from reawakening. Human intuition is often dismissed as coincidence, yet intuition may be the residue of an ancient education. We are not born blank slates. We are born with predispositions, inclinations, patterns of thought that have no origin in our brief lives. The Sumerians did not invent the systems they used. They recognized them. Recognition is a form of remembering, even if one cannot recall where the memory came from. Modern science admits that instincts exist, but hesitates to ask how. Why should a species that supposedly evolved through survival need instincts for mathematics, celestial navigation, and symbolic reasoning? These instincts serve no survival purpose in a primitive environment. They serve a civilizational one. That alone implies that humanity's earliest context was not primitive at all. It suggests that civilization preceded humanity, as we understand it today, and that our minds carry traces of that lost environment. The Sumerians may have been the first to articulate this condition explicitly. Their worldview did not ask why humans knew what they knew. It assumed humans had been taught. Their gods were not omnipotent creators but instructors. They bestowed knowledge because knowledge was necessary. In their myths, humanity exists not as accidental inhabitants of a world, but as participants in a project. Whether that project was meant to continue or merely persist remains unclear. The withdrawal of the ancient overseer suggests that the project reached a point where direct intervention was no longer required, or no longer allowed. If one views history through this lens, the Sumerians cease to be anomalies and become inevitabilities. Everywhere humans settle, civilization eventually appears. It may take centuries or millennia, but the pattern repeats. People build cities, establish laws, track the heavens, and define hierarchies. These behaviors emerge wherever humans remain long enough, regardless of environment. Traditional explanations attribute this to evolution, but evolution does not explain why the same patterns recur. Evolution explains adaptation. It does not explain replication. Civilization behaves less like invention and more like recovery. Each cycle begins with fragments, hints of knowledge that appear spontaneous but feel ancient. Humans are compelled to structure their existence, compelled to pursue questions that serve no immediate survival purpose, compelled to measure, record, and preserve. These compulsions reflect neither instinct nor curiosity alone. They reflect memory. The Sumerians tried to preserve their memory consciously. Later civilizations did so unconsciously. Modern humanity does so mechanically. Our devices remember for us, storing information we no longer bother to internalize. This shift marks a new transition, one the Sumerians did not experience. For them, memory was a burden they carried. For us, it is something we outsource. If memory moves beyond the human mind, does civilization become dependent on tools? And if those tools fail, what becomes of the memory they contain? Perhaps the next collapse will begin not through destruction, but through a glitch. The old world may have collapsed because its systems became too complex for any mind to understand. Ours may collapse because those systems become too autonomous to question. The Sumerians built archives to shield knowledge from decay. We build networks to accelerate its multiplication. Theirs was a world terrified of forgetting. Ours is a world incapable of noticing what it forgets. Reading Sumerian tablets today is an act of rediscovery, but it also exposes a deeper truth. We did not invent our story. We inherited it. Our myths are echoes of their myths. Our sciences reflect their approximations. Our architecture shadows their geometry. Our languages retain their rhythms. Even our concept of time, divided into units they defined, remains a monument to their memory. Yet, despite all this continuity, the meaning behind the structures has faded. We know how to measure time, but we no longer understand why time was structured. We know how to build, but we no longer understand the cosmological significance of direction and form. We believe progress is linear, but our history curves like a spiral. Every turn brings us back to questions the Sumerians asked, but never answered. The true mystery is not what the Sumerians knew, but what they suspected. They sensed their place within a repeating sequence. Their myths do not speak of origins, but of returns. They did not question whether gods existed. They questioned why gods left. They did not wonder how humanity came to be. They wondered why humanity remained. Something had departed, leaving humans behind with tools they barely understood. That departure may have been the catalyst for the cycle. Once guidance is removed, civilizations attempt to mimic the structure they inherited. They succeed for a time, then crumble when the limits of their understanding are reached. The cycle ends when comprehension collapses. It begins again when memory re-emerges. The span between collapse and emergence, the dark age in which stories become legends and legends become gods, is the gap where humanity forgets it ever knew anything. That gap may have lasted millennia before Sumer. It may last millennia again if we repeat the mistake. The Sumerians stand as a pivot point in this cycle, the first to write their memory clearly enough to survive. They did not write for themselves, they wrote for us. Their tablets are not history, they are instruction. They are not myth, they are fragments. They are not stories, they are warnings. If we mistake those warnings for fantasy, we become different from those who watch their world dissolve beneath the weight of forgotten meaning. Perhaps that is why humanity continues to search the past with such intensity. We are not hunting for simple answers. We are seeking orientation. We feel the pull of memory we cannot name. We sense that our technologies, our questions and our fears are not new. We invent telescopes not to explore, but to find. We build archives not to preserve, but to reconnect. Every act of discovery may be an act of recognition. If that is true, then the Sumerians were not the beginning of civilization. They were its signal flare. Their existence is evidence that humanity had already risen, fallen and risen again. The cycle did not start with them, and it will not end with us. The only unknown is whether this time humanity will see the cycle clearly enough to break it. Understanding may be the catalyst the Sumerians lacked. They held memory, but not meaning. We hold meaning, but risk losing memory. If we combine the two, the cycle might not repeat. If we fail, it will. If humanity stands on the threshold of recognition, then the question that emerges is not whether the past still affects us, but whether it ever stopped shaping us at all. The Sumerians may have been the first to document their inheritance, but they were not the only ones who lived under its shadow. Every civilization since has grappled with an invisible presence, patterns of thought, fragments of belief, architectural compulsions, social hierarchies, and cosmological arrangements that seem to pre-exist human choice. These patterns did not emerge spontaneously. They behave like instructions imprinted into the very structure of consciousness, waiting for circumstances to reactivate them. Human beings do not simply create civilization. They reenact it, as though following a script written before memory formed. One might imagine that this script exists not in stories or genes alone, but in something far older and deeper, an echo of design embedded into human awareness. The mind does not arrive empty into the world. It arrives hungry for patterns. It seeks order, rhythm, repetition, symmetry. These impulses are not survival necessities. They are civilizational foundations. They compel us to gather, organize, measure, build, and question. They are the residue of something older than history, perhaps older than humanity itself. The Sumerians understood this instinctively. They believed knowledge was not discovered but restored. Their civilization arose rapidly because the patterns they followed were already present within them. Modern society assumes consciousness produces structure, but what if structure produces consciousness? What if the human mind evolved not to adapt to the world, but to recall a world that once existed? Our fascination with ancient ruins, forgotten languages, lost technologies, and vanished cultures may not be nostalgia. It may be identity struggling to return. We excavate not because we are curious, but because we are incomplete. Something in us knows that the story we have been told is not the first chapter. Something whispers that we have lived before, not individually, but collectively. Every time humanity reaches a new height, it looks backward. Our monuments imitate older ones. Our myths echo older stories. Our questions mirror older fears. Even our greatest breakthroughs do not feel like inventions. They feel like revelations. Electricity existed before we knew how to harness it. Gravity existed before we understood it. The stars followed their paths long before we could map them. Knowledge is not born when we learn it. It is born when we remember it. The Sumerians preserved memory because they recognized that forgetting was the enemy of existence. But remembering is not merely an act of recollection. It is an act of responsibility. Memory without responsibility is trivia. Responsibility without memory is chaos. The Sumerians tried to balance both, yet their world eventually succumbed to imbalance. Their knowledge outlasted their comprehension, and once comprehension died, memory became burden. A civilization cannot sustain what it no longer understands. Perhaps this is why cyclical history feels inevitable. Civilizations do not collapse because they fail to innovate. They collapse because they forget why innovation matters. They lose sight of the reasons beneath the rituals, the meaning beneath the systems, the purpose beneath the power. When form survives without function, structures become shells, and shells, no matter how grand, cannot withstand time. This same vulnerability shadows our present. We have built a world of unprecedented complexity, yet few understand its foundation. We create technologies that reshape existence, yet cannot articulate the consequences. We accelerate without direction, believing movement equals progress. But speed without awareness is not journey, it is drift, and drift always leads back to silence. The Sumerians stood at the beginning of one cycle, unaware of how close they were to the end of another. They believed they were restoring knowledge for future generations, yet they themselves misunderstood parts of what they inherited. Their rituals became increasingly ornate as meaning faded. Their gods grew distant. Their cities expanded even as the purpose behind their design dissolved. Eventually they mistook remembrance for faith. Once that happened, collapse was assured. Modern humanity risks repeating that mistake in reverse. We abandon ritual not because we reject meaning, but because we no longer understand what ritual defended. We remove systems without knowing what they stabilized. The Sumerians preserved what they could not expand. We expand what we cannot preserve. Both trajectories lead toward the same precipice. If cycles continue until understanding replaces memory, then perhaps humanity now stands closer to a turning point than any civilization before. For the first time, we possess tools capable not only of preserving knowledge, but of analyzing the patterns beneath it. We see parallels across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. We find flood myths, sky beings, teacher deities, cyclical timelines, and celestial alignments in nearly every ancient civilization. Traditional scholars dismiss these as archetypes, yet archetypes do not form without origin. They replicate because something real produced them. There may have been a moment, long before Sumer, when human beings knew why the world was structured, not merely how. That moment has become myth, dissolving into symbols we no longer interpret correctly. The Sumerians caught the echoes closest to their source. They were not innovators, but translators. Their tragedy was that language itself had already shifted. They wrote what they understood, but understanding was incomplete. What remains of their world invites speculation. What if the original civilization was not human in the sense we understand? What if humanity was not designed to discover knowledge, but to maintain it? In such a scenario, collapse would be inevitable whenever comprehension failed. Each cycle would begin with fragments left behind like breadcrumbs. Some generations would follow them more faithfully than others. Sumer followed them with precision, yet even they could not trace the entire path. Humanity now gathers not fragments, but fragments of fragments. We decode symbols left on temple walls, analyze astronomical alignments, measure pyramid proportions, and construct narratives to explain why ancient people behaved as they did. But perhaps the question has always been reversed. The ancient world did not behave strangely. We behave strangely because we have forgotten the context that shaped them. Our confusion reflects the gap in memory, not their lack of wisdom. If there is a pattern, then comprehension is the missing variable. Understanding requires perspective. To understand perspective, we must step outside the story we are living. That requires consciousness capable of seeing the cycle, instead of merely existing within it. The Sumerians glimpsed the cycle from its beginning. We glimpse it from its height. Both viewpoints distort truth differently. They saw fragments without origin. We see patterns without destination. Some might wonder whether the cycle could be broken. Perhaps it can, but not through accumulation of knowledge alone. Knowledge is only potential. Meaning is direction. Without meaning, knowledge becomes burden, noise, distraction. The Sumerians built archives because they could not build comprehension. We build machines because we cannot build purpose. Both acts reflect the same deficiency. Breaking the cycle may require a synthesis of the two. Memory strengthened by understanding, understanding guided by memory. A civilization that sees itself not as the first or the last, but as a participant in a sequence, might behave differently. It would not confuse progress with novelty, nor confuse ancient wisdom with superstition. It would recognize inheritance not as weight, but as identity. It would realize that the story of humanity did not begin when we learned to write. It began when we learned to forget. If forgetting is the engine that drives the cycle, then remembering, fully, not partially, may be the only escape. The Sumerians remembered just enough to rebuild the world, but not enough to transcend it. We remember fragments they preserved, yet lack the framework to integrate them. Perhaps this time the cycle has shifted. Perhaps we have awakened early enough to see the arc before it bends. Whether that awareness changes anything remains uncertain. Knowledge does not guarantee wisdom. Recognition does not guarantee action. But cycles do not persist because they are unbreakable. They persist because no civilization has understood them deeply enough to choose differently. The Sumerians did not choose, they inherited. We, for the first time, may decide, and that decision may reveal whether the story humanity tells itself is a loop or a spiral. A loop returns to the same point forever. A spiral returns, but never in the same place. If we carry memory into meaning, the spiral may rise. If we do not, the loop will continue. The choice remains unwritten, for now. If humanity now stands in a position where choice becomes possible, then that choice must be rooted in something deeper than curiosity or ambition. It must emerge from identity. Identity not as an invention of culture, but as a recognition of purpose. The Sumerians lived without the luxury of such recognition. Their world was defined by memory they did not choose, rituals they inherited, and systems they could not explain. They existed inside a narrative written before their arrival, guardians of knowledge they preserved but never fully understood. Modern humanity, however, stands at a threshold where understanding may become attainable, where the fragments of memory scattered across civilizations may finally align into something coherent. Yet coherence is not guaranteed. The very forces that sustained ancient civilizations, structure, meaning, continuity, are increasingly eroded by disconnection, fragmentation, and acceleration. The more humanity expands, the less it remembers. We gather information without integration, knowledge without context, history without continuity. We treat the past as a foreign country rather than as the foundation of our existence. In doing so, we weaken the very memory the Sumerians labored to protect. Civilizations do not collapse because they lack information. They collapse because information loses meaning. The Sumerians carved warnings into clay because they feared the erosion of purpose. They understood that once the connection to origin is severed, systems become hollow. Rituals lose effectiveness, Symbols lose depth. Laws lose justification. When a civilization no longer knows why it exists, existence itself becomes unsustainable. The collapse becomes inevitable, not through destruction, but through irrelevance. Humanity today is at risk of such irrelevance. We possess more data than any civilization before us, yet we struggle to derive meaning from it. We construct technologies that modify reality, yet remain unsure why reality should be modified. Innovation becomes compulsion rather than direction, and direction dissolves into flux. The Sumerians feared forgetting. We fear stagnation. But stagnation through abundance is no different from stagnation through absence. When the mind cannot decide what matters, nothing matters. This crisis reveals something fundamental. Meaning cannot be discovered outwardly alone. It must be recovered inwardly. The Sumerians preserved external memory because internal memory had already been lost. Their tablets were prosthetics for consciousness, devices meant to anchor a world drifting toward amnesia. Modern humanity does not preserve memory externally because we have lost it internally. We outsource cognition to machines, allowing technology to think on our behalf. The danger is not that machines will surpass humans, but that humans will cease to understand themselves. Perhaps this is where the cycle reaches its turning point. The Sumerians encountered memory without meaning. We encounter meaning without memory. They remembered more than they understood. We understand more than we remember. Between these two deficits lies the potential for synthesis. If memory and meaning converge, the cycle might break, not through force, but through recognition. Recognition requires context, and context requires confrontation. Humanity must confront its origins not as myth, but as inheritance. The Sumerians were explicit. The world did not begin with them. Knowledge did not emerge from trial and error. It was given, restored, or recalled. Their myths describe beings who shaped humanity deliberately, who imparted wisdom because wisdom was necessary. Whether those beings were literal entities, symbolic representations of a prior epoch, or metaphors for something beyond comprehension remains secondary. What matters is the pattern. Humanity did not ascend into awareness. It was placed into awareness. This placement suggests design, and design implies intention. If humanity was intended to remember, then forgetting becomes the fundamental flaw of each cycle. Forgetting turns intention into accident, inheritance into confusion, and purpose into myth. Once myth takes hold, civilizations behave not like stewards, but like wanderers. They act without understanding the implications of their actions. They repeat structures instinctively, without knowing why those structures exist. They build pyramids without grasping geometry, calendars without grasping cosmology, temples without grasping metaphysics. They replicate because they cannot originate. Modern civilization does not replicate ancient forms physically, but it replicates their patterns mentally. We construct digital systems analogous to ancient archives. We create virtual hierarchies that mirror priesthoods. We organize knowledge into layers of access, just as ancient societies guarded mystery schools. The shape of civilization repeats, even when its materials change. Plastic replaces stone, code replaces clay, satellites replace observatories, but the structure remains intact. This structural recurrence reveals that humanity is not inventing civilization. It is reassembling it from memory, guided by impulses older than conscious thought. If such impulses stem from a previous epoch, then the Sumerians were not merely chroniclers of the past, they were placeholders for the future. Their role was not to define civilization, but to ensure it could be restarted. They were custodians of continuity, not originators of truth. The truth may lie farther back, beyond Sumer, beyond flood, beyond myth, and what survives today are only the faintest ripples of that earlier reality. The Sumerians' knowledge hints at a world where meaning and memory were once unified, where humanity understood both its purpose and its origin. That world did not vanish because it was inferior. It vanished because comprehension decayed. Once decay set in, collapse became inevitable, and memory was scattered like seeds. The Sumerians gathered those seeds, but seeds alone cannot rebuild the orchard that once existed. Seeds need vision. They need understanding. They need gardeners aware not only of how plants grow, but why growth matters. Without that awareness, gardens become wilderness, still alive, still beautiful, but directionless. Civilization becomes wilderness when it can no longer distinguish between knowledge and noise. Perhaps the world before Sumer, whatever shape it took, mastered meaning to a degree no later society achieved. Perhaps that mastery was the reason its collapse was so devastating. When meaning decays at a high level of complexity, collapse is not partial, it is total. The Sumerians inherited only fragments because fragments were all that survived. Their ability to build suggests that those fragments were powerful. Their inability to transcend suggests that those fragments were incomplete. Modern humanity possesses more fragments than any civilization prior, yet more fragments do not guarantee reconstruction. Pieces do not assemble themselves. Interpretation requires insight. Insight requires perspective. Perspective requires humility. Humility requires recognition that we are not the first to stand here, not the first to wonder why we exist, not the first to seek knowledge, not the first to fear forgetting. If humanity recognizes that it is part of a cycle, then the past ceases to be distant, it becomes immediate. The Sumerians cease to be artifacts, they become predecessors. Their warnings become instructions, their failures become lessons, their memory becomes our opportunity. Opportunity, however, demands response. The cycle will not break because we identify it. It will break only if we act differently within it. That action begins not with technology, but with awareness. Awareness that civilization is not an accident. Awareness that our instincts are not random. Awareness that history is not a line, but a pattern. Patterns do not lie. They repeat until acknowledged. The Sumerians preserved the first half of the pattern. We may hold the second. Whether we unite them defines what comes next, not for them, for us, and for whoever may come after. If the trajectory of human civilization hinges on whether memory and meaning converge, then the forces that govern this convergence must be examined. Ancient cultures sensed these forces intuitively, yet few articulated them directly. The Sumerians came closest, encoding them in symbols, numbers, astronomical alignments, and myths that modern scholarship often misinterprets as religious poetry. But poetry does not survive millennia without reason. These symbols endured because they represented truths deeper than language. The further humanity drifts from those truths, the more history appears arbitrary. Yet patterns remain, stubborn and persistent, as if reality itself refuses to let them fade. These patterns suggest that civilizations do not arise by accident. They crystallize around certain thresholds, moments when external conditions and internal awareness intersect. The first threshold is survival, the basic struggle against chaos. The second is memory, the preservation of lessons learned. The third is meaning, the interpretation of memory. Most civilizations reach the first threshold, some reach the second, almost none reach the third. The Sumerians approached it, but lacked the perspective to cross. Modern humanity is poised before the same gate, but with a problem the Sumerians did not face. We confuse information with knowledge and knowledge with wisdom. In doing so, we risk missing the threshold entirely. Information is accumulation, knowledge is comprehension, wisdom is orientation. The Sumerians understood this hierarchy, even if they could not articulate it explicitly. Their scribes collected information because they feared knowledge would vanish. Their priests protected knowledge because they believed wisdom sustained the world. But wisdom cannot be preserved physically, it must be embodied. Once embodiment ceases, wisdom disintegrates into ritual, ritual into memory, memory into symbol, symbol into dust. The Sumerians clung to memory because wisdom was already slipping away. Humanity today may be repeating that slip in reverse. We have access to knowledge beyond any prior civilization, yet increasingly lack the capacity to process it meaningfully. Our tools outrun our comprehension. Our systems grow autonomous. Our understanding grows fragmented. In such a world, wisdom appears antiquated, something associated with the past, not the future. But wisdom has nothing to do with age. It has to do with integration, Without integration, knowledge is noise and information is burden. The Sumerians hinted that this burden once broke the world. Their myths describe floods, collapses, and cosmic resets not as punishments, but as responses to imbalance. When systems lose coherence, the universe seeks equilibrium. Collapse becomes correction. If that pattern persists, then what we call catastrophe may be neither random nor malicious. It may be cyclical, a structural safeguard that activates when civilizations drift too far from meaning. The Sumerians emerged after such a correction. They preserved what they could, but lacked the origin context to avoid future imbalance. Modern society may stand before a similar inflection. The difference lies in scale. The Sumerians inherited fragments of a single region. We inherit fragments of an entire planet. Each culture preserved different aspects of the same forgotten story. Egyptians preserved the architecture of cosmology. Vedic sages preserved the metaphysics of consciousness. Mesoamerican priests preserved the mathematics of cycles. East Asian traditions preserved the harmonics of duality. Aboriginal peoples preserved the memory of a dreaming world. When viewed individually, these traditions seem contradictory. When viewed collectively, they form a mosaic of something remarkably coherent. Yet coherence requires synthesis, and synthesis requires intention. The Sumerians possessed intention but lacked the breadth of memory. We possess breadth of memory but lack intention. This inversion marks the most dangerous phase of the cycle. A civilization brimming with knowledge but starved of purpose is like a titan whose limbs move without mind. Such a being destroys not through malice, but through confusion. The Sumerians feared losing memory. We fear losing identity. Yet these fears are not separate. They are opposites of the same missing truth. Identity emerges from continuity, and continuity emerges from memory. A civilization without memory cannot define itself, only imitate. That imitation may appear innovative, but innovation without heritage is directionless. The Sumerians interacted with their past as if it was sacred, not because they worshipped antiquity, but because they sensed that memory anchored existence. They walked backward into the future, eyes fixed on the world they had inherited. We sprint forward with our backs to the past, confident that speed will compensate for blindness. Speed does not break cycles. Awareness does. For awareness to form, humanity must confront a possibility rarely considered in modern discourse, that civilization has a function, not a social function, political function, or material function, but a metaphysical one. The Sumerians implied this through their relentless emphasis on order. They believed cosmic balance depended on human participation. Humanity was not an observer of the universe. It was a component of it. If humans forgot their role, the universe recalibrated, sometimes violently. This idea is not unique to Sumer. Countless ancient systems propose that consciousness and cosmos are intertwined. The Egyptians believed the king maintained the balance of existence. The Greeks believed humans were expressions of divine order. The Vedas taught that reality itself was mind-like, not matter-like. Modern science describes patterns that suggest the universe is structured through intelligible laws, yet denies the implications of intelligence. In doing so, it repeats the Sumerian mistake, preserving structure while ignoring meaning. If meaning exists, then the cycle of civilizations may not be a punishment, but a lesson. Each cycle grants humanity another opportunity to align memory with purpose. When alignment fails, collapse resets the stage. Not because collapse is catastrophic, but because it is corrective. The Sumerians encountered the aftermath of such correction. They were inheritors, not initiators. Their world was a classroom missing half the curriculum. We now hold the missing half, scattered across thousands of discoveries, philosophies, traditions, and sciences. The fragments exist. The question is whether we will recognize them as fragments of a single whole. If we do, the cycle changes. If we do not, the cycle repeats. Recognition is not an intellectual act. It is existential. To recognize inheritance is to accept responsibility for it. Responsibility demands orientation. Orientation demands humility. Humility demands admitting that we are not the origin of our story. The Sumerians accepted this without hesitation. We resist it fiercely. Our resistance blinds us to the truth they preserved, that the universe does not ask humans to invent meaning. It asks us to perceive it. Meaning is not created, it is discovered. When meaning is forgotten, civilizations fall. When meaning is remembered, civilizations rise. The Sumerians preserved memory because they feared the fall. We pursue meaning because we fear the void. Between these two fears lies a decision, one no previous civilization has recognized in time. The question now is not whether humanity will learn the past. The question is whether humanity will remember itself. Because memory without self-awareness collapses, and self-awareness without memory drifts. To escape the cycle, both must unite. Only then will history cease to repeat. Only then will the story continue forward instead of folding back. Only then will the future become something other than another beginning. If everything humanity has ever built, questioned, preserved, lost, or rediscovered has been part of a sequence of remembering and forgetting, then the story of civilization is not a ladder climbing endlessly upward, but a spiral moving through epochs of awakening and sleep. The Sumerians lived at the first visible turn of this spiral after a darkness we can barely imagine. They stood at the opening of a new world and carried embers from the previous one without knowing how those embers were lit. Their tablets, rituals, and cosmology were not inventions, but echoes. A record of an inheritance they did not comprehend, yet felt compelled to protect. They understood one truth more deeply than any civilization that followed them: forgetting is death. In this truth lay both their strength and their failure. They preserved memory, but not meaning. They remembered fragments of law, not the essence of order. They recorded cycles of the heavens, not why the heavens mattered. They guarded knowledge like a flame, but did not know how to rekindle its source. Their achievements were monumental but bounded. Their architecture reached upward, but their awareness reached only backward. They saw themselves not as destiny's authors, but as guardians of something older than humanity itself. Their burden was to preserve a world they could not recreate. And yet, despite their efforts, the spiral turned. Their memory frayed, their language fractured, their rituals calcified into habit. Their kingship became authority without origin. Their gods transformed into myths. Their purpose dissolved into story. What had once been instruction hardened into symbol, and the symbol became opaque. When meaning evaporated, collapse followed, not with fire, but with silence. What remained of the Sumerians was absorbed, reinterpreted, distorted, and scattered across new civilizations like seeds cast into stony soil. Those seeds germinated in Egypt, Akkad, Babylon, Greece, and Rome, each inheriting a piece but none inheriting the whole. We now stand at the opposite end of that spiral, heirs not only to Sumer, but to every misinterpretation, every fragment, every symbol divorced from its origin. Our world carries more knowledge than all ancient civilizations combined, yet it carries almost no wisdom. Our memory is digital, externalized, and fragile. We have replaced clay tablets with code, scribes with servers. Our archives are vast, but not eternal. We assume that technology protects us, forgetting that technology itself requires meaning to endure. Without meaning, machines are not memory. They are mirrors reflecting the emptiness within. The Sumerians once believed that forgetting triggered collapse. They were right, but they misunderstood the nature of forgetting. Forgetting is not the absence of memory. It is the absence of connection. A civilization can retain every word it has ever written, and still collapse if it no longer understands why those words matter. Meaning, not memory, sustains worlds. Meaning binds humanity to purpose, purpose to identity, identity to continuity. Once meaning dissolves, memory becomes noise. And yet, there is a difference between our time and theirs. The Sumerians inherited memory but lacked perspective. We inherit perspective but lack memory. They saw fragments of a vanished world and mistook them for origins. We see fragments of countless worlds and sense that they belong to something greater. They stood at the beginning of a cycle without knowing what came before. We stand near the end of a cycle knowing precisely what lies behind us. Not a straight line, but a pattern. Recognizing the pattern is the beginning of awakening. For the first time in recorded history, humanity can see that civilizations rise not because they are destined to, but because they remember enough to rebuild. They fall not because they are weak, but because they forget enough to drift. The cycle continues until a world emerges capable of both remembering and understanding, of preserving memory without worshipping it, and of creating meaning without severing it from the past. The Sumerians preserved the first half of this equilibrium. We hold the second. They handed us the question. We must supply the answer. The cycle ends not with revelation, but with recognition, a moment when memory and meaning meet, when humanity ceases to inherit blindly and begins to participate consciously. To break the cycle is not to escape history. It is to finally enter it. Perhaps this is why the Sumerian tablets survived fire, flood, empires, and oblivion. Perhaps they were never meant for their descendants, but for us. They waited for a civilization capable of seeing what they could not. That memory without meaning imprisons, and meaning without memory disintegrates. The tablets are not relics. They are keys forged by a forgotten world, preserved by a fallen one, and rediscovered by a rising one. The question that haunted the Sumerians is the same question that confronts us now. What is humanity? Not a species, not an accident, not an orphan wandering through a meaningless cosmos. Humanity is a participant in a story far older than its recollection, but not older than its potential. A story that repeats until someone remembers why it exists. The Sumerians remembered enough to begin. We remember enough to choose. Cycles do not end because time progresses. Cycles end because someone understands. The Sumerians did not. We may. And if we do, then the forgotten world they inherited will not return as ruins or myths, but as recognition, awakening not from the past, but from within. In that moment, history will no longer be an echo. It will be a voice, the first voice humanity has ever truly heard, and it will speak not of what was lost, but of what was always waiting to be found.